There's an old joke recounted by Dr. William Dembski about a scientist who says to God, "I can do anything that you can do." God asks, "Really? Like what?" And so the scientist says, "Like create a human being." Then God says, "Show me." And so the scientist gets out a whiteboard and he starts to explain how to create a human being from scratch. And he explains, well, we start with some dust and then, but God interrupts. "Wait a second, get your own dust." This joke captures the essence of any cosmological argument. A cosmological argument is any argument that uses the mere existence of the universe to infer the existence of God. There are several different cosmological arguments, but perhaps the most popular one is captured by Gottfried Leibniz's famous question, why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there anything at all? The scientist may boast that he understands the human being down to the molecule, but he is speechless at the question of why does something exist rather than nothing exist. Even in principle, the scientist has nothing to say. To that, we must turn to the philosopher. Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Stanley, and today we're going to examine two cosmological arguments and their objections. Next episode, we're going to discuss a third cosmological argument, the king of cosmological arguments, the Kalam cosmological argument. And if you're a Christian, or at least a theist, I hope that your takeaway is that there are good arguments for the existence of God. In fact, even if you're not a Christian, perhaps especially if you're not a Christian, I want you to know that this is not some whimsical, irrational faith. There are good reasons to think that a God exists. And these arguments have been around for thousands of years. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't get it from Sunday school or a weekend indoctrination seminar. Christians have a deep and profound history with robust intellectual rigor stretching back for thousands of years. Anti-intellectualism within Christianity is a relatively recent trend that I think is on its way out. All of the Ivy League schools were founded by Christians in order to spread knowledge and to think through difficult things, especially theology. So I want you to hear the arguments for the existence of God, and I want to encourage you that if you're interested in more arguments for the existence of God, I have also covered the teleological argument, also known as the fine-tuning argument for God, and I think you can find that in our catalogs, and I hope that would be worth your time. Before we dig into the cosmological arguments, I want to thank you first for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. If you enjoy our show, please like our Facebook page and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or on Facebook Recommends, or however you are listening. Submitting a review or interacting on social media is a really good way to support the podcast. You can also subscribe on YouTube, where you will find our full catalog of episodes. It's really a cool thing to see your feedback, and I sincerely appreciate that you might take 2 or 3 minutes to help us out. You can also find everything that I've just mentioned or contact me at wellreadchristian.com. Finally, I want to sincerely thank several listeners for their donations over the past several years. Reese has been donating nonstop, sending me encouraging notes and thanks. I hope you find our discussion of Aquinas' cosmological argument enlightening. Marco, Felicia, Michael, Joy, Grant, Fabian, William, all these people are people who've donated in the last year, and I'm really touched that you guys enjoy the podcast enough that you would go out of your way to cover some of the costs that are associated with it. So thank you for your listenership and for your generosity. Although philosophers from Plato to Descartes and beyond have defended various cosmological arguments, there are 3 versions of the cosmological argument that stand out as compelling and debated today. The first that I want to talk about is Thomas Aquinas' cosmological argument. Now, Thomas Aquinas was a tremendously influential Christian philosopher and theologian who lived in the Middle Ages. And Aquinas' goal was to synthesize Christian theology with Greek philosophy. Aquinas argues that the universe is constantly in motion, that all of the objects in the universe are constantly subject to change, and there needs to be something that causes things to change from potential to actual. The common example that some Thomists use is that of a banana. Now, a banana has the potential to become rotten. And a modern thinker would say that that happens all on its own, that the oxygen and other elements will cause the banana to decay. But Thomas Aquinas would say that as an object, if you use the universe to explain the becomings of a banana, then that doesn't really help, because then you have to explain, well, how does the oxygen do its work? And if you explained that the atmosphere or whatever, he would say, well, how does that do its work? And you would trace a chain of causes back, and you have two choices. Either that chain of causes either goes back infinitely, and I don't mean infinitely in time, I mean infinitely in sequence. Either that goes back forever, or at some point there is something that causes the universe to continually move, to function. And an example that I think might be helpful is, think of a watch. It wouldn't be helpful to Thomas Aquinas to say that, well, all of the watch can explain all of its own inner parts, right? If you just have enough gears, it will move on its own. For Thomas Aquinas, God is the spring in the watch. And it doesn't matter if you have an infinitely big watch with an infinite amount of cogs, you're still going to need a spring to eventually make all of it tick at the same time. God is the uncaused cause. He is the unmoved mover that pushes every object in the universe forward, like the spring in a very large and complicated watch. Notice that unlike other cosmological arguments that we're going to get to later, Aquinas' argument does not presuppose a beginning to the universe. All right? We're not talking about time here. We're not talking about causes in time. Even if the universe was infinite, Aquinas would still argue that motion, or really, more accurately, change, is not possible without an unmoved mover. Otherwise, all of the objects that exist would be permanently fixed as whatever those objects are. Some philosophers criticize Aquinas' argument from change as inextricably linked to Aristotelian metaphysics. You see, this argument assumes that there are such things as concrete objects that actually change. That seems pretty reasonable to me, but many thinkers since the Enlightenment actually believe that there are no objects at all. Everything that exists is actually one massive object, one large mosaic that rolls forward in time. And on this view, substantive change is an illusion. David Hume, the massively influential Scottish philosopher who lived during the Enlightenment, was the first to challenge the notion of causes and effects. For David Hume and his vision of reality, Aquinas' argument doesn't even begin to work, because there are no objects that are undergoing any change. There's just one large object that's rolling forward in time. If David Hume's vision of reality is correct, then Aquinas' argument from change doesn't really work. But instead of cowering before neo-Humean metaphysics and abandoning Aquinas' argument, I think we should instead challenge the neo-Humean metaphysics, which sees the world in counterintuitive ways. Put simply, I think the ancient intuition about the way the world is makes more sense than the modern intuitions. Let me explain. An Aristotelian view of metaphysics sees the world as a collection of objects, things with causal powers, and when those causal powers actualize, they produce effects. So, for example, a baseball has the causal power of shattering a window. I have the causal power of throwing a baseball. And when I do throw a baseball, the effect might be that a window shatters. On this view of metaphysics, Aquinas' argument stands tall, because how can any substance change unless an outside force acts upon it? Notice the Newtonian ring that you're probably hearing at this point. Any object that's being acted upon can only change its substance if something else acts upon it. And so if you trace those causes and effects, at some point you need an uncaused first cause, right? What causes me to pick up the baseball and throw it? Ultimately, at some point, you're going to have to stop and say, Mark just felt like doing it. And so Aquinas would say that I partner with God in creating causes, but ultimately, even I, as a substance, am subject to God pushing the gears of the universe to make things work the way that they work. On a neo-Humean perspective of causes, however, a neo-Humean would see the universe as one large mosaic. They don't see baseballs and people and glass windows. For a neo-Humean, they say that if you want an accurate picture of me throwing a baseball through a window, what you really should do is take quick snapshots of reality and give an account for every molecule in the relevant area and measure its energy and its mass. And if you know the laws of physics and you take snapshots of the world at any given point of time, then you have all of the fundamental truths that you need. Notice on this picture, change is, in some significant sense, an illusion. It's a legal fiction. It's a human-centric description of events. Reality is like a flip book with a still picture on every page. If you flip through it quickly, it looks like there are real objects interacting with other objects, but really, it's a series of unconnected snapshots. Similarly, if you are a dispassionate scientist, you know that everything is really made up of tiny atoms, which are determined by the forces of energy, and there are no actual objects. Here's a helpful illustration. Imagine if I created an animated movie of, let's just say, me throwing a baseball into a window. The neo-Humean would say of that animated movie that it is not true that a baseball caused the window to smash. What's really true is that individual glowing colored dots on a screen makes your brain interpret objects. When you watch the screen, you import all of these notions of objects and causes and effects and change and continuity. You import all of that. But if you change your perspective on this animated movie, you realize that it's actually just a collection of blinky lights. Importantly, there's not really a person or a baseball or a window. Those objects do not have fixed borders. You use those terms to describe what you see, but the reality is just a loose collection of blinky lights. For the neo-Humean, reality is a lot like that animated movie. Objects are completely illusory. Causes and effects are useful descriptions of the world, perhaps, but not concrete or fundamental things. Everything is just one rolling event, just like an animated movie that goes on forever. Now, you may interpret objects in the movie, but the objects are not there. That's an interpretation of your brain. There are no real boundaries that separate those objects. Objects are merely human-centric illusions. One philosopher puts it that you cannot carve reality at the joints. I believe that was Plato who originally said that. Yeah, anyway. So here's the question when it comes to a neo-Aristotelian view of causal powers and a neo-Humean view of causal powers. This is the question. Do you think reality is more like a video game or more like a movie? In a video game, this is a very millennial example, I know, forgive me. Actually, I'm Gen Z, but it doesn't matter. Who cares? Anyway, for a neo-Aristotelian, reality is a lot like a video game. There are rules, there are concrete objects, there are physics engines, and this sort of thing. And if you run around in the sandbox of sorts, you can trigger certain actions, which cause certain events. The motions that you make in the controller cause the game world to react. The neo-Humean, however, sees the universe more like an animated movie rather than a video game. Now, at a glance, the movie looks a lot like a video game. But if you adjust your perspective, you realize that it's actually a flat screen. There is no input. There are no objects. There are no causes. There are no effects. It's just the rolling of a tape as the animators draw things that they feel like drawing. But really, it's just an assortment of colors. Or, in the case of reality, it's just an assortment of atoms. Now, the reason I tell you any of this little brief lesson in metaphysics, the reason I tell you this is because if it is true that reality is more like a rolling animated movie, and there are no objects, there are no causes, there are no effects, and there's no change, then Aquinas' argument fails. But my response is that Neo-Aristotelianism fares much better than Neo-Humeanism. Although please note that all I have really done is tried to sketch the positions and offer my intuitions. More intense and technical arguments are certainly available for those who are interested in metaphysics. And metaphysics, of course, is the study of reality as a branch of philosophy. But for now, I'd like to move on to a different cosmological argument, one that is not dependent on Aristotelian metaphysics. This brings me to Gottfried Leibniz's cosmological argument, also known as the argument from contingency. Leibniz was a German philosopher and mathematician who lived during the Renaissance, and he was very impressed by Aquinas' cosmological argument, but he distinctly wanted to divorce it from Aristotelian metaphysics, which were falling out of fashion in no small part thanks to David Hume. And further, Leibniz had a deeper question that he wanted answered. Leibniz asked, why is there something instead of nothing? Why does anything exist at all? Take any chunk of matter that you like as an example. Your coffee table, your car, the moon. Why do the atoms and molecules that make up that object exist? Surely they didn't have to exist. The world would have gotten along just fine if any particular object didn't exist. So why does any particular object exist? Why does the world exist? Why is there something instead of nothing? And this question is an expression of the intuition that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. Things don't just exist without a rational reason. That's what makes science possible. Science is possible because we understand that there's a reason why things are the way that they are. And when we investigate the world, we discover those reasons. If we find a cub in the zoo, we can rest assured that there's a mommy and a daddy lion somewhere, right? If we find an arrowhead in New Mexico, we can rest assured that some indigenous tribe crafted it centuries ago. If you spot a tree in your backyard, it is safe to assume that it was once an acorn. This idea that everything that exists has a reason for its existence is called the principle of sufficient reason. Many philosophers of the rationalist persuasion especially are convinced that the principle of sufficient reason is axiomatic for reason itself. After all, how can you even use a logic if some things might be true or false without any explanation or reason at all? Stephen Davis at Claremont University asks you to imagine that you encountered a Bigfoot or a strange car, and your friend commented, "Oh, that? Yeah, there's no explanation for that. There's literally no reason why it exists. It's just there, and that's all." That would be quite a weird response. In fact, you could rest assured that your friend is wrong, because anything that is a thing has some kind of reasonable explanation for why it exists rather than why it doesn't exist. Here's another picture. I believe it was Charles Taylor who said that if you found a translucent orb in the middle of the forest, surely it would be irrational to think that there's no explanation at all for its existence. And if you expanded this orb to encompass the whole universe, the need for an explanation doesn't magically go away. There's still an object that seems peculiar, and therefore an explanation for how it got there or why it's there is warranted. So Leibniz argues that everything has an explanation for its existence. And that explanation either rests on another contingent thing, or its explanation rests in its own nature as a necessary thing. Let me explain. To take the cub again as an example, the cub's existence has to do with biological and historical facts. The cub could not have existed if the world had been different in a myriad of ways. And so, the existence of the cub is considered contingent. No mommy and daddy lion, no baby cub. The baby cub is dependent on the existence of its parents, and is also contingent, because maybe it exists, and maybe it could not exist. The same logic could be applied to, say, a Bigfoot-like creature or a strange automobile. If you encountered one of these objects, your reasoning faculties are working properly if you conclude that Bigfoot was born at some certain point in time, or that the automobile was assembled and created at some certain point of time, or by a designer at least. But take, for example, the number 13. There is no possible world where the number 13 doesn't exist. Imagine a world where the only thing that existed is a single grain of sand. Even in that universe, it would still be true that 7 plus 5 equals 13. Oh my gosh, 7 plus 5 equals 12. I wrote that wrong in my notes. That's hilarious. And if you zoomed in on that grain of sand, don't get distracted. There's a grain of sand. It's the only thing in the universe. If you zoomed in on it, it's still true that 7 plus 5 equals 12. And if you were counting, say, the atoms and molecules that make up this grain of sand, you might hit the number 12 or 13 as you're counting up those tiny molecules. So there's no possible world where the number 13 doesn't exist. Notice then that everything which exists, or even could exist, can be categorized in 3 ways. The first category for a thing is impossible. An impossible thing is something that cannot exist in any possible world, even in our imagination. A circle with 4 corners is a good example of something that could never exist even in our imagination. The second category of thing is that it can be contingent, and that means that it could exist or it could not exist. A cub is a great example. The third category is a necessary thing, meaning that it must exist in every conceivable universe. Actually, it's more than that. Even in universes that we couldn't possibly conceive, even there, necessary beings must exist. And usually, the only example that philosophers usually agree on are abstract objects. So things like properties or relations or other things like this. Numbers are often considered abstract objects, depending on your philosophy of abstract objects. Sometimes numbers are included, and so these things are necessary beings. And so Leibniz then says that the universe itself and all of the physical contents are contingent. All of the objects in the universe and the sum of those objects, which is the universe itself, is contingent. It's not necessary. It seems like you could interchange the parts. The universe doesn't exist in the same way that the number 13 exists. Therefore, the principle of sufficient reason demands that there be an explanation for the universe's existence, because everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in another contingent thing, like the lion and the cubs, or it exists as a necessary thing, in which case the explanation is that it's necessary. There is nothing inside the universe that can explain why the universe exists. And so this principle of sufficient reason says we need an explanation for the universe. Notice that even if you came up with something in the universe that appears to be self-creating or something like that, you still would have to ask yourself, why is there something that is self-creating instead of nothing that is self-creating? This is Leibniz's question. Why is there something instead of nothing, when it seems conceivable that there could have been nothing at all? Stephen Hawking famously said that because gravity exists, the universe can and will create itself. Now, Hawking was a brilliant scientist, but he was a terrible philosopher. The question can then be asked of gravity. Why does gravity exist? And why does it exist in the way that it does? Since, at least conceivably, gravity could have been slightly stronger or weaker, but it's not. Gravity exists exactly the way it is, contingently. And therefore, even gravity needs to be explained by something outside of itself. Leibniz says that if the universe and all of its contents are contingent, then there needs to be a sufficient explanation for its existence. And if you're looking for necessary beings that are immaterial to explain the universe, abstract objects are not candidates as explanations, because abstract objects never stand in causal relations. 2 times 10 make 20, but that has never put $20 in my pocket. Har, har, har. Hew, hew. Okay, so if you're looking for a necessary, non-material thing that can cause the universe, It is reasonable to postulate a necessary mind, because minds are not material. And it seems like all material is contingent. And so therefore, since it can't be an abstract object, it needs to have causal powers. An abstract mind, or a immaterial, I really should say immaterial mind, is a contender for something that could cause the universe. And so Leibniz suggests that there's a necessary immaterial consciousness at the base of reality that created the universe. Now that is a cogent explanation. You might not agree with it, but it makes sense. Now notice, you have to notice this. Leibniz is not saying we don't know where the universe came from and therefore God. What Leibniz is saying is, look, something about reality must be necessary and foundational. Otherwise, there would be nothing at all. But since there is something, and not nothing, then whatever is there must be caused at root by something that's necessary and foundational. All right? So because there's something instead of nothing, there must be something about the universe that must exist. There must be something that is necessary. And that something that's necessary is not physical. It can't be, because physical matter is contingent. It could exist or it could not exist, and we'll talk about that later. That's his argument. And quite frankly, his argument is a really good one. Now, there might be objections to it, all right? But this is what grown-ups do when they're studying philosophy. You can recognize that there's a good argument, even if there are also good objections. And so we're going to discuss those objections in a second. The key takeaway here is that Leibniz concludes that God is the sufficient explanation for the universe. God exists necessarily out of his own nature as the essential foundation for reality. God is the answer to the question, why is there something instead of nothing? And if you say, well, why does God have to exist? The answer is, if God didn't exist, then nothing would exist. And if you ask, well, why doesn't nothing exist? The answer is, I don't know. Apparently, because it's in God's nature that he must exist. That's part of who he is. It's a part of why there is something instead of nothing. So let's talk about some objections now. I think you get it. The most common objection to Leibniz's argument is kind of an amateur objection. And if you haven't thought of it already, then I'm surprised, because most people think of it pretty quickly. They think, okay, well, why can't the universe just substitute for God in the argument? Right? The most common objection is, look, if the universe needs to be explained by something that is fundamental and necessary, then why can't the universe itself be fundamental and necessary all on its own? After all, God is fundamental and necessary on his own, so why can't the universe be fundamental and necessary on its own? Why can't the universe be its own explanation? And whenever I hear this, I know that it's from a non-philosopher. And hear me out. The reason is because in order to argue this, you have to argue that everything that exists, every atom, every molecule, every dust mote, everything exists exactly how it does out of metaphysical necessity, which means that it is literally impossible in any hypothetical universe for things to be different than the way that they are. In fact, you can't even think about hypothetical universes. Your view suffers from what is called a modal collapse, where there is no such thing as maybe, could be, possibly, only exactly what is. And in case it's lost on you how bizarre this view is, you couldn't even say that the fundamental particles of the universe could be swapped out for alternative particles that are exactly the same. No. All the fundamental parts of the universe are just that. They are fundamental and necessary. You cannot add or subtract. You cannot swap. You cannot imagine. There's only one possible universe, and that is the one that currently exists, eternally and without derivation. You can't add one more molecule. You can't subtract one more molecule. Instead of displacing God in the argument, you simply promote the universe itself to godhood. And no serious atheist philosopher ever is really interested in defending this. And if you want to insist that the universe is necessary, you actually have to insist that everything in the universe is necessary. And not only do you have to assert that in order to defeat Leibniz's cosmological argument, you also have to defend that with arguments of your own to show that it is more reasonably true than false. Remember, this means that you have to argue that every single stitch, every quark of the universe, whatever the most fundamental basic particle is, every stitch of it has some magical essential quality that makes it impossible for reality to exist unless that particle was there. This strikes most people as intuitively unreasonable. Now, you can believe this. You can go this route. There aren't any professional philosophers who do, but there's nothing about it that's scientific. It is deeply counterintuitive, and it's extremely difficult to actually argue for. In other words, it's a very high cost view to take just because you want to avoid a possible God conclusion. And most of the time when people try to cash this out, they end up accidentally promoting the universe to godhood. They end up basically saying that the universe is God. I want to be absolutely clear here. The question is not, is God the fundamental necessary being, or is the universe the fundamental necessary being? Nobody wants to defend the notion that the universe is fundamental and necessary. That's a tough nut to crack. So the real debate around Leibniz's cosmological argument is about whether the universe actually requires an explanation at all. No one tries to explain the universe by saying that it's necessary. Instead, they try to explain the universe by not explaining it. They try to say that the universe is exempted from explanation. And there's two ways to try to do this. The first is either to reject the principle of sufficient reason, or you can make an exception for the universe itself. Now, either route ends up being question-begging, and let's begin with the rejection of the principle of sufficient reason. So some philosophers are willing to go so far as to say that it is not true that everything has an explanation for its existence. Some things just exist without any explanation at all. Now, this claim might backfire, all right, because Richard Swinburne is a Christian philosopher, really good one actually, and he points out that you might want to be careful with that one if you are willing to say that some things exist without any explanation at all, because then you could actually just say that God exists without any explanation at all. And I don't think many atheists are going to want to have to debate the notion that God exists without any explanation at all. Christians and atheists alike, really all philosophers who want to think critically about things, have to subscribe to the idea that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. So denying the principle of sufficient reason really gets you in trouble, because it's a core tenet of logic itself. It's one of the laws of logic, at least some philosophers are convinced. Now, imagine where this gets you if you deny the principle of sufficient reason, right? Not only is it dangerous because then you can just assert God without any reason, but how can you even observe the world and make conclusions if there are some things that have absolutely no explanation? How is it rational to pursue truth if it's possible that for some pieces of reality, there actually is no truth to discover? Can you imagine if you stumbled across a Bigfoot-like creature only to discover that there is no explanation for its existence? It has no parents, it has no genetics, it has always existed, and it will always exist. There is no rhyme or reason to its behavior. It just exists, and that's it, for no reason. I mean, how could you even live in this kind of world? How could you? This is just absurd. How could you investigate a murder if sometimes, for absolutely no reason, bullets materialize at fast rates of speed and puncture organs? I mean, how could you disprove a theory without a principle of sufficient reason, or PSR for short? The PSR is basically an articulation of the view that the universe is sensible and logical and predictable and repeatable. And this principle of sufficient reason is the foundation for both the classical and the modern worldview. But that's where you get yourself if you deny the principle of sufficient reason. You end up abandoning a classical and modern worldview. And I'm just curious, how are you even going to argue for the denial of the principle of sufficient reason? Are you going to give an explanation for why some things don't need an explanation? And how are you going to decide which things are exceptions to the PSR and which things aren't? So a tractor and a quarry, that has an explanation for its existence. And the quarry has an explanation for its existence. And the continent has an explanation. And the world that the continent is on has an explanation. And the galaxy has an explanation. But if you zoom out far enough, if you encompass the whole galaxy, nope, No more explanations. No more thinking. I mean, it's just absurd if you want an explanation for the universe. I mean, the thinking just stops as soon as you get a big enough question or a large enough area of space. I mean, that is seriously how some philosophers think. They actually accept that line of thinking. And normally, I try to be really respectful and analyze all arguments from all sides. But this one, I have a really tough time with it, as you can tell. So just so you know, in the academic realm, usually people are trying to debate the fine points of the principle of sufficient reason, and they're trying to define it in a way that excuses the universe. But unfortunately, if you excuse the universe, you end up excusing a lot more things than just the universe, and that's why it falls apart. Okay, moving along. Because it is basically impossible to provide a cogent rejection of the PSR, most philosophers, what they really do is they opt to instead to classify the universe itself as the only exception to the PSR. Bertrand Russell, an influential atheist philosopher from the 20th century, I think he died in the 70s, he famously debated this position against Frederick Copleston. And their debate about the existence of God screeched to a halt as they went back and forth on the issue of whether the universe should be excused from the PSR. Because Russell wanted to pretend, I don't want to be that way. Bertrand Russell held the position that the universe does not need an explanation for its existence. It simply exists as a brute fact. And because Copleston thought that that was ridiculous, that the universe should get some kind of pass, they went back and forth on this and never really made any ground. And Copleston commented in later works that this is kind of a tactic, this is a common tactic of those who do not want to ask questions that may lead to a transcendent being. Copleston says that if you stop asking questions and simply assert that some things just are without any explanation, then you have cut off reason at its head. If you insist that the explanation for the universe is just a pseudo problem, and that you're not actually answering anything, you're actually putting a stop to the debate. You're not achieving anything. If you refuse to make a move when playing chess, then of course you can't be checkmated. And again, I just want to remind you, in case you've forgotten, God is not a cop-out answer, right? Because we have an explanation for why God exists. It's that he's a necessary being, and the universe is not a necessary being. No one wants to argue that, because then you have to argue that every molecule in the universe is necessary. So I think the best strategy is the Bertrand Russell strategy for the atheists, is to try to say that somehow the universe is an exception to the principle of sufficient reason. But I don't know how they're going to come up with a reason for why, a principled reason for why the universe should be accepted from the PSR. So that is where the debate is today. In contemporary thought, critics argue that theists are begging the question. I actually don't want to assume that you know what begging the question means in this context. Begging the question in philosophy means that you have presumed your conclusion before you've gotten there, that you've assumed your conclusion and then now you're pretending to argue for it. They say that subjecting the universe to the PSR is begging the question. And theists say the same exact thing about atheists. They say, look, if you try to say that the universe is the only exception to the PSR, then you're just begging the question in favor of atheism. You're just assuming atheism before you even begin to argue, is another way to think about it. So there is where Leibniz's argument rests. I think it's a very powerful argument. And I want to say this, as now that I'm starting to reflect, pop culture atheists today are so intellectually arrogant. They pronounce self-righteously that you must be irrational and immature to believe in God. And that idea comes from Freud, actually. Okay, that doesn't come from the arguments. Stephen Davis at Claremont University points out that maybe the atheist is right about this argument. Maybe the universe really is the only exception to the PSR. But you can't call theists irrational for believing that the universe is contingent and therefore needs an explanation beyond itself. That is a reasonable thing to believe. That is perfectly rational. That's a rational argument, even if it turns out to be mistaken. Right? Maybe we're wrong about that, but it's not a conspiracy. All right? We're not rejecting any science. We're not blindfolding ourselves against reason. There's no God of the gaps. Okay? Well, what we're saying is, look, the universe is not necessary. Right? No one wants to argue that the universe is necessary. It looks like the universe exists when it might not have existed. Okay? So why is there something instead of nothing? And the answer has to be that there is something foundational to reality that must exist, apparently. Otherwise, nothing would exist. And that thing can't be made of matter, right? And it can't be an abstract object, which is the only thing we know of that doesn't have matter, because abstract objects don't stand in any causal relations. And so therefore, there's a mind. There must be something foundational to reality that is necessary, that is powerful enough to cause the universe. And when you're thinking about something that with causal powers that is not material, the only other thing is a mind. There is no other category of thing that we know about. And if you try to say something like, well, maybe there's a category of thing we don't know about, then what you're going to have to come up with is something that is not made of matter and molecules and has causal power. All right, so the only thing that is even conceivable is a mind. Right? It's some kind of consciousness. That's there. There's only two categories. All right, something that is made of matter or something that is not made of matter. Something that can cause things, something that cannot cause things. Those are the categories there. All right, so there's no sleight of hand here. No magical voodoo. Well, maybe, but you don't know, man. It's like, okay, you don't know, man. It's not an explanation. It's not an answer. Right? So if you're looking for a rational answer, if you're looking for a rational explanation, this is a good argument. If you want to just say, we don't know, and throw up your hands, that's not an explanation. I mean, you're welcome to that opinion. But don't say that you are somehow wiser or that you have a better position or better argument. You're not even arguing for your position. Right? You're just saying, I don't know, and I'm not going to argue for it. Well, great. But we do have an answer. We do have an explanation, and it makes sense. So don't pretend like Christianity is some intellectually bankrupt enterprise. I think that after everything is said and done, Leibniz's argument is very powerful. And the question of why there's something rather than nothing is potent, especially considering our finite nature. I want you to think about this. I know that, I don't know if my tone has been exactly the tone that I want. I want to have a caring, compassionate, thoughtful tone, and I'm not sure I've communicated that. But what I'm trying to say here at the end, to wrap things up, look, if we were eternal, if we had no beginning and no end, it might be reasonable to assume that we are God. But because we are born in a certain time and certain place, we're thrown into the world with dizzying speed. We're swept off the world just as quickly in death. It's entirely reasonable to ask the question, what the heck is going on? Where did the universe come from? I think from an existentialist perspective, it's completely rational to say, justify yourself, universe. What are you doing here? What am I doing here? Why is all of this stuff here when it could have never existed at all? Why am I here when I could have never existed at all? And the Bible says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the whole earth is filled with his glory. Everything that exists because God wanted to share his happiness and display his glory. And I think that is not only a cogent answer, but it is a beautiful answer. Next episode, we're going to unpack the most recent evolution of the cosmological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, we've discussed Aquinas' cosmological argument from change, which I still think is powerful if you do the work to argue for an Aristotelian metaphysic. And we've discussed Leibniz's cosmological argument from contingency, which is a powerful argument, even to modern-day people, because it is grounded in modern intuitions. And finally, next episode, we're going to look at the Kalam cosmological argument, which pulls in the vast scientific evidence and philosophical considerations that point to a beginning of the universe. And the beginning of the universe puts the atheists in a very uncomfortable position, because now they can't even say that the universe is necessary. Because if it was necessary, it would have always existed. So it can't be necessary. It came into being from nothing, for no reason, and without any explanation. That is a really hard pill to swallow. And so the Kalam cosmological argument is going to be a very fun argument to examine next episode. Thank you very much for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast. Okay, so this is the state of the debate of Leibniz's cosmological argument. I did not mean for that to rhyme, and it's distracting me. All right, cut.